Hey everyone, Julian here, and welcome to episode 12 of the Learning Flask series. In this episode, we're going to be working with configuration. Now, configuration in a Flask app is a way for us to set some default configurations and load different configuration environments depending on what kind of environment we're working with, whether we're in production environment on the server or we're developing locally on our local machine. So I think the best way to show you is with an example. So let's jump into our main screen here. As always, I do have a text-based version of this. I'll throw a link in the description. We've got localhost running with our development server, we've got VS Code, and we've got our terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and run our app. And you can see here we're running in development mode. And we're running in development mode because we've gone ahead and exported the Flask env variable as development. So Flask env equals development. And now if we Flask run, you can see that we are in development. If we changed this to production, the environment would be running in production mode. Now, the reasons for this are going to make more sense once we dive into some configuration. So, what is configuration in Flask? Well, like I said, it's a way of creating some default keys and values which contain important information that we want to be able to use in our app. I'm talking information like secret keys, API keys, database usernames, passwords, anything that's kind of sensitive that you don't want to hard code into your app. You can then dump them in a config file and then bring them in. So a lot of the time people won't put their configuration files into version control because it contains sensitive information. So let's go ahead and learn a bit more about config. So in here I've just got our index root, and what I'm going to do is just print app.config. And now if we go home, you can see here we get this massive dictionary-like object called config, which has got all these values in. Now, these values are the default configuration values which are set by Flask. You can see here we've got secret key, we've got debug, we've got our env, which is set to development. Debug is set to true, testing is set to false, and these are all defaults which are set when you declare the env environment, and in our case it's development. So we can treat this like a dictionary which we can then access from any part of our application. And you know, an example of that, if we go app.config secret key, if I go ahead and just refresh that, it's printing none because we haven't actually set a secret key. Now don't worry too much about what secret key is. We're going to learn all about that in a couple of episodes time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that out of, no, in fact we can leave that there. Oops. What I want to do is show you how easy it is to set values in the app config. So just like a dictionary, app.config, and then access the key, in our case secret key, and then we'll just go ahead and throw something in there. And now if we go ahead and rerun and head to our terminal, you can see it's printing out the new value that we've set for secret key. But the config variables aren't limited to the default. So for example, we could go ahead and create our own. So app.config db username, db username, and then we can assign that a new value. So we'll just call that root for now. And then if we go ahead and print that, save, reload, and you can see here down in the terminal it's printing out the value that we've set for the db username. Now the great thing about the Appconfig object is that we can access it from any part of our application. So that's why we go ahead and we want to initiate the config as soon as possible, so we've got access to it everywhere throughout our app. But I'll show you how to do that shortly. So you've learned how to assign and access the config attributes, but that's not particularly useful, especially as your app starts to get bigger. You know, you're going to have different environments which are going to have different different variables for with different values. So for example, in your production environment on your server, you want to load in a config which might have a different secret key. It's going to have a different DB username, a DB password, all kinds of authentication variables which we only want to use in a production environment. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we can create a configuration file. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete all of that for now. So let's create a configuration file, and I'm just going to put it right in the root folder of our app. So new file, config.py. Now there's lots of different ways of doing this, and I'll throw a link in the description to the Flask documentation, but this is the way that I like to do things, and that is by creating configuration classes. So let's start this out by creating a, sorry guys. So let's go ahead and create our base class, and I'm going to call it config, which is going to inherit the object. So first things first, let's go ahead and declare some kind of global attributes that the config class is going to have. So debug, I want to set as false, and testing, I also want to set as false. Now let's go ahead and create some child classes that are going to inherit our config. So we want a production config. So we'll go ahead and create that, and that's going to inherit the config class. So that's going to inherit all of the attributes that are attached to config. And for now, I'm just going to put pass in there, and I'll explain why shortly. We want a development config, which is also going to inherit config. And for now, I'm going to change debug to true, because when we're running in the development environment, we want to be able to debug our app using the Flask interactive debugger, which I'm sure you've all seen. You definitely don't want that in a production environment. It's really important that you do not run debug true in a production environment. And we don't need testing in our development config, so we can leave that as false, because this is going to inherit these attributes here. So we can leave that as is. And then let's create one for testing config, and that's also going to inherit config. And we want, well, we can leave debug as false because that's going to inherit it there, but we do want testing. So there we go. This is the kind of most bare bones kind of config that you could get. And we've created a base config class where we can go ahead and assign attributes here that are going to be available throughout all of these child classes which inherit the main config. So we've got one for production, we've got one for development, and we've got one for testing. So let's go ahead and actually populate these with some examples. So let's set our secret key. Now, if you're running this in a real environment, you don't want to just type in something. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you do, but you want to use something more secure. So go ahead and import the secrets module from Python, and then create yourself a nice secret key here, or use the os.random, and that will give you a nice random string as well. So all of these classes are going to inherit this secret key, which is fine, you know, absolutely fine. But let's say we want to access a database. So we might have a DB name, and we'll call this just production DB for now, and we will have a DB username, and I'll just call this root, and DB password, and we'll just set this as example for now. Now what this means though is that all of these classes are going to inherit the values for DB name, DB username, and DB password, which we might not want, probably don't want. So for example, I'm going to copy these down to development, and I'm going to change this to development DB. And you might not even have a username or a password on your local database, so you can either go ahead and delete them or leave them as is. I'll leave them there for now. And we might want to have a separate testing database, or it's just going to use the same as the development DB. So we want to make sure that we overwrite these values with these new values that we want in our subsequent configuration classes. And everything in production config is just going to inherit everything from the base class. So we can go ahead and leave that just with pass, and then we can access all of these attributes from production config. So you might want to have, let's say, a path to an uploads directory. So we'll just call this uploads for now. And this is going to be the path on your server. So, it might be in home and then your username. And then let's say your app is in the home directory. And that's going to be in our app module, in the static directory, images and uploads. Now this isn't fixed, obviously you can do whatever you want. But this will be the path on our server. Now the odds are the path to where you want to upload images to on your development machine isn't going to be the same as this. So what we'll do, we'll go ahead and overwrite that in the development config. So for example, if you're using some kind of a Linux machine, it's still probably going to be home, username, and in your home folder, let's say you have a directory for projects, and then maybe the name of the project. So we'll just call this Flask test, and then inside there you then have app with the app module and then the path to the uploads directory. So I hope you can see what's going on here. We're changing and overwriting the base attributes here depending on what kind of configuration we're using. So I want to go ahead and also overwrite this in our testing, just like so. And let's do one more for good measure. We will do, let's see how I'm just looking through them now, the session cookie secure. So this is a default of the Flask configuration variables, and basically what it means is that it will only send cookies back and forth if there's a secure HTTPS connection, which is what we want on the server. We want our cookies to always be protected, but odds are if you're running locally you're going to be using the Flask development server, so that's not going to be running over HTTPS. So we change these to false. So I think that will do for now. So I hope you can see what's going on here. We leave production config as is because it's going to go ahead and inherit everything from here. And any of the values that we want to overwrite in development or testing, we just go ahead and assign them a new value. So that's all good. That's our config file. How do we actually use it? Well, I want to attach our configuration to the app object that we've created immediately as soon as it's created. And we do that because you might be running some extensions that want to use the attributes in your configuration. So we'll go ahead and do that immediately after we create the app. So we do that with app.config, and then when I type from, you can see here we get a few different options. We get from envar, which will load from environment variables. We got from JSON, which will load from a JSON file, from mapping, which I believe is, why is it not giving me from mapping? I believe that's just a Python file with like a variable and a value set. But again, go ahead and check the documentation because there are lots of different options to do this. And we got a few others here. What I'm going to do is from object. And then to that, we pass the name of our configuration file. So ours is config, and then the class of configuration that you want to run. So let's say we want to run our development config. We'll go ahead and put config.development.config. So it's going to hit this file, find config, well, it's config file, and then it's going to look for the development config object and then load in all of these values, which is also going to inherit these and overwrite anything that we want to change just for development. So that is how we can actually load our configuration file into Flask, and now we've got access to all of these attributes throughout our application. So for example, we'll go ahead and save that, and in our views we'll just use this root for now, and we'll go ahead and print app.config, and then we want to print the env, which is one of the defaults. So if we now come back, let me make some space here because you can't see the terminal. Come back to the browser, go ahead and reload, and you can see here we are in development. And now let's say we want to access one of the attributes that we set. So our DB name, I'm just going to copy that now, come back to our view, and we'll fetch that. Go ahead and reload that. You can see here it's printed out development DB. And the beauty of the app config is that the config is available, like I said, throughout our whole application. So at any point in our app, we can access these values. So, you know, really useful, really useful. So, you know, you might have some part of your app that connects to the database, which probably isn't going to be in your views file. Then you can just go ahead and connect to the database and pass in the values of, you know, app.config, DB name, DB username, and DB password, and then that's going to pull those values from your configuration file and then load them in. So that's how we work with a configuration file. But doing it this way, or the way that I've just shown you, doesn't allow us much. Well, I mean, it's absolutely fine. It works, it gets the job done. But it's going to be a bit annoying if we've got every time we want to deploy our app, come back in here and change this to production config. And every time we want to work on it locally, we've got to come in here, we've got to change this to development config. If you want to do testing, you've got to then change that to testing config. So it's just a bit of a pain in the arse to have to keep doing that. So a pattern that I quite like to use is dynamically changing this value depending on our Flask env environment variable. So we can do the following. Just under where we've created our app object, we can do if app.config, and then the key I want to access is env, and if that's equal to production, then I want to go ahead, I'm going to indent that there, and then change this to production config. So if the Flask env variable is set to production, we're going to go ahead and load the production config into the application. And if it's not set to production, we'll throw in an else clause, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, paste that in there, and I'm going to change this to development config. And in fact, what we could do is throw an elif in here. So elif, I'm just going to copy that. If env equals testing, then I want to go ahead and load the testing config. And of course, I forgot our colons there at the end of the if statement. So I'm going to change this to testing config, else it's going to load development config. So I hope you can see what's going on here. And if we go ahead and just print app.config env, in fact, let's I'll cut that, and we'll just place that in our home view, just like so. Go ahead and save. Now, if we run this, oh, we got an error. Did I miss out something? Nope. Let's go ahead and close that and Flask run. Okay, so we're still set in the development environment. If I go ahead and reload that, okay, that's fine. It just didn't pick up the changes that I made. So we can see here we've printed out development, and maybe I'll make that a little bit clearer just by we'll throw an F string in there. And of course I'll need to change these. So let's put Flask env is set to like so. And we'll run this one more time. So we could say Flask env is set to development. So our development config has been loaded because the Flask env environment variable is set to development. So what happens if we want to change this? Well, let's come out, let's stop our Flask app and export Flask env equals production. And now Flask run. And you can see here we get a big fat warning from Flask telling us not to use the development server in a production environment. And we are going to be covering that shortly. We've got a few more things that we're going to cover in this series. We're going to build our own application and we're going to deploy it to a server. We're going to deploy it using a few different ways. We're going to use a virtual machine in Google, in DigitalOcean. We're going to use Google App Engine. We'll deploy it to AWS, Heroku. We'll do all sorts of cool stuff. So hang tight and expect those coming relatively soon. So here we are. We're in a production environment. And if we go ahead and reload that, you can see here our Flask env is set to production. So let's say we want to connect to a database. We might want to, in one of our routes, probably not in a route, but somewhere else in the application, is connect. So let's just throw in a print here and app.config db name. And because we're in our production environment, we've loaded the production config. So our DB name is going to be production DB. So if I go ahead and refresh that, why is this not? Why is it not picking up the changes? Might be because we're in development mode and it's not auto reloading. So I'm just going to stop that and Flask run again. Go ahead and refresh. There we go. We get production DB. So I hope that all made sense. Like I said, there are lots of ways to configure a Flask app. You can use environment variables. You can use a simple file which just has variables. You can do what we've done here and create a class and then some subclasses. And of course, I've not seen this method be used before, so I'd be interested to hear people's opinions on this. Maybe there's something that I'm overlooking here, but for me it's been working pretty well. It allows us to just dynamically load the configuration depending on what environment variable we set. And because by default in the production environment it's going to set this as production, it's always going to load the production config from our object here. And it's only when you explicitly set it to testing or to development is it going to load these configurations. So I think that's everything for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are enjoying the series, then feel free to subscribe. I've got plenty more videos coming soon. If you like the video, hit the like button and leave any comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear your feedback on this sort of configuration setup. As always, I do have a text-based version in the description and I'll throw in a link to the documentation as well. So, as always, thank you for watching and I will see you in the next one.